Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a nice 9-game Major League Baseball slate. I say it's nice, but it's going to be a difficult slate for fantasy. We do have a very strange slate today. Uh, let's look at the weather first here. So we do have weather concerns in this one. The Washington game has a little bit of it question mark, but not too much of one. The Yankees, meanwhile, does have a pretty big question mark. This game is somewhat dangerous, so do keep that in mind. There's definitely ways to go here, but this is a little bit of a risky game. The Miami Atlanta game does have a little bit of risk as well, but not too much either. So I think that this is going to be a pretty solid slate in general. And we have, I don't think there's going to be any weather outside of that Yankees game, but I think it should play regardless. So let's go ahead and get into the slate. Let's look at our pitching first. Now, I do have a core play of Skeens for Pittsburgh. I mean, he's going to be extremely high owned. He's been phenomenal so far this season. Even against good teams, he's been good. And even though Arizona is a mid-level team, he has really good potential today. He'll be the top play on the slate by a wide margin, probably when it comes to usage and things like that. And he projects very well and he has the highest K rate by over a strikeout across this slate. So now, I will note that there's actually quite a few good pitchers on the slate. It's going to be a very strange slate. About half the teams project really well, and about half the teams kind of project pretty terrible, and that basically due to the pitching potential situation. So let's get our GPP plays in here. So Corbin Burnes looks like a really decent play, though he is facing Cleveland. His upside here is a little bit capped because his K rate is going to be a little bit lower in this game than his traditional, which isn't perfect either because he's 5, 6, or 7 quite a bit lot this season. So I think he's definitely going to get at least 5, but trying to get to 6 and 7 is going to be a little bit harder against Cleveland here. But he doesn't give up too many earned runs, and so as long as he only gives up 1 or 2, then he definitely has some real good potential on this one, as he should have some good fantasy potential. Then we'll look at Garrett Cole for the Yankees. Now he's only pitched in a handful of games. His last game against the Mets was really rough. He gave up a bunch of home runs. He's had a couple of those type of games this season so far where he gave up a bunch of home runs. But the other games he's pitched well, and he's got a favorable matchup here against Toronto, who he did pitch well against once already. And so he definitely has some potential today. He is a GPP play, but he's a little bit riskier. But his price being a little bit cheaper does help some here. Eovaldi for Texas is kind of a GPP / extreme GPP play today. His ceiling is not as high today against Boston because of the matchup here, but his strikeout rate is good enough that he's definitely in play, but he's high risk, high reward on this particular slate. A couple extreme GPP plays to consider. Max Fried, he's coming back from the injured list again. He's should be getting in the mid 80s in the pitches today, which he's definitely capable of a solid game in that situation. And the strikeout potential is good here against Miami, who does not have a lot left once they've traded away some of their players. And he's been really good against Miami this season, averaging 30 fantasy points a game. He's only had 10 strikeouts in those 2 games as well, because they just don't have a lot of power to hit the ball. So I think that he's got some phenomenal potential on this slate. If we look at the 2 games he pitched in, he had 4 and 6 strikeouts in those 2 games and gave up 1 run combined. I think he's a very decent play, but he is an extreme GPP play because he may not go as deep, which would limit his potential a little bit. But he's a little bit cheaper than some of the guys like Burnes and Eovaldi, so he's definitely in play there. Looking at Pivetta for Boston, he's got a interesting matchup here against Texas. Now, his ceiling has not been as high as we'd like at times, but he does have a high ceiling. He's had some really bad floor games, though, so he's been somewhat inconsistent. You're probably going to know in the first couple of pitches whether he's going to have a good game or a bad game here. The problem is that we have to make the determination on him beforehand. So right now he's an extreme GPP play. He's got a good enough strikeout potential to be viable, but he's definitely high risk, high reward on the slate because he's somewhat boom or bust. Looking at Waka for Kansas City, he's got a favorable matchup against Detroit. Now, Detroit does have a tendency to have a decent game occasionally, and he has struggled against them this season already, but he does have some potential here. And while I do think some Detroit bats have some upside, he's definitely a decent extreme GPP play, kind of a punt almost that you could utilize here at this position. A couple other guys to consider, Spencer Arrighetti. Now, he projects well from a fantasy perspective, but he does have a tough match against Houston. I don't really see why he projects all that well, but he is going to be somewhat high owned. I guess it's probably because of his price point and that he does have that 20 fantasy point potential, even though he hasn't hit it a lot recently. I do think he's an interesting option, though, because his K rate is a little bit better than I expected it to be for this game. With that said, he's definitely going to be a very borderline boom or bust type of play, but he's going to have ownership, and if he does well, then he could definitely hurt you. Looking at a couple Hail Mary plays, Sean Woods Richardson from Minnesota. He's facing the White Sox, who are just abysmal. Now, he hasn't done well against the White Sox this season, but he didn't give up a home run in the 2 games. The problem here is he doesn't get a lot of strikeouts. He's not super cheap either for to be a Hail Mary play, really, but he's just so borderline that I figured I'd mention him as kind of a punt in that position. Looking at Ryan Nelson, he's the other Hail Mary play. Now, he's a lot cheaper than Woods Richardson, and he has been pitching pretty well. He's had several 20 fantasy point games over the last 5 games. And in those, he has faced pretty weak opponents, and Pittsburgh does have some guys that can hit home runs. But he really hasn't given up a ton of home runs this season, though he has given up more on the road, which is a little bit of a concern. His ceiling is actually pretty good considering that situation, and he's actually got a pretty decent strikeout rate for the price point. Though it's not a must play by any stretch of imagination. He's purely a Hail Mary punt play. All right, so let's look at our bats. So the bats today, how do I pick? Hang on one second. So you said, yo, I can't get Chisholm Jr. at the outfield only. Well, he could play third base or outfield today. And then how do you pick single entry players for tournaments? You just have to, trust your gut. That's really the best thing. And just try to be a little bit chalky, but then somewhat contrarian around other positions. All right, so let's go and get in our bats here. So let's look at catchers. William Contreras is expensive today, but he is the top overall play for Milwaukee. Though he's not a must play, I really do like him, though, as he does have some home run metrics today, and he's been good against Washington so far this season. And he's got some home run upside as well, so he's definitely capable, though he's going to be somewhat hard to roster with that price point. And we do have several value plays at this position, one being Sean Murphy for Atlanta. Now, he has struggled so far this season, but he has been hitting the ball better lately, which gives him some potential today, and he's dirt cheap at $3,400. Similar priced, Connor Wong is in play as well. Now, he's hit the ball very good, and he's been solid lately. Boston doesn't project as well as they normally do, though, so he's a little bit of a high-risk, high-reward situation, as he is facing a pitcher that at least looks somewhat decent on the slate. So he's probably not a must-play, but he's definitely somebody to consider today. And then we also have Gary Sanchez, who is going to be the cheapest play here, who's been inconsistent but has some good home run metrics today as well. Even though he's kind of struggled throughout the season, he hasn't been starting a lot of games. He does start today, and so he does have that nice potential at a cheap price. The ownership here, Gary Sanchez, Austin Wells, and William Contreras. Low-owned upside guys, Sean Murphy, Yasmani Grandal, and Salvador Perez. I do think Salvador Perez and Adley Rutschman are two contrarian options as well at this position. So looking at first base, this position is not super deep, but I also like 5 guys. I think there's 5 players you can choose from, and I think you can't feel bad about any of them. I really wanted to make somebody at this position a core play, but I couldn't decide which one to use. Matt Olson is a good play. He's pretty pricey, though. He's a little bit higher risk than some of the other options just because of the price point, but he's definitely in play today as my favorite play at the position. But if we look at Rhys Hoskins, his home run metric is off the charts today. He's my favorite guy to hit a home run. He's about as close to a core play without being a core play that I can get. The only reason he hasn't been considered a core play is because he just has absolutely too many guys that look really good at this position. Ben Rice for the Yankees does have some nice value today as a kind of contrarian play as well. Though he's not a must play and he doesn't look as good as Hoskins, he's a little bit cheaper, so he can help you fit other guys. Vlad Jr. is in play today. Now, he doesn't have the best metrics today against Cole, but he is an interesting play as he's been hitting the ball very well lately. And then if you want to get a little more punty, Nate Lowe for Texas looks pretty solid today from a home run perspective. I was a little surprised to see him pop up here as he's not really hit the ball that great lately, but he does have some nice potential on the slate. The ownership here, Matt Olson and Rhys Hoskins, are going to be 1-2. low-owned upside guys, Rowdy Tellez, Ben Rice, and Salvador Perez. But Hoskins, clear-cut, the top home run play of the slate, and so he's definitely somebody that you have to consider a lot here. Looking at second base, we do like Jose Altuve a lot. He really hasn't done a lot in the last few games, though, so that's a little bit concern. But he does have that home run metric, and he can get some stolen bases occasionally. He can definitely put up some fantasy points in bunches when everything kind of fits. And this position's relatively weak today. I don't love the next pick options, whereas you have Brandon Lowe, who's in a projects well today, and he did well yesterday, in fact, as he projected well yesterday, but he's not a must play. Marcus Semien, meanwhile, is interesting for Texas today against Pivetta, though I do think Pivetta is a decent pitcher. He does have some good home run metrics today, but I do worry that he doesn't get the hits outside of the potential home run. And then Chris Morel for Tampa Bay, also somewhat interesting today, despite the fact that he has he's had 2 games against Houston where he hasn't done a whole lot other than get walked or strike out. So I think that he's in play, though, but it's high risk, high reward. Looking at the ownership here, Jose Altuve, Willie Castro, Gleyber Torres, Chris Morel, and Brandon Lowe. The low-owned upside guys, Andrew Montantero, he's actually somewhat interesting today for Milwaukee. Is kind of a cheap Hail Mary play there. Kiner Falefa and also Whit Merrifield in play. But a couple kind of contrarian options, Brooks Baldwin, Ketel Marte, and Luis Garcia Jr. Now, Brooks Baldwin hit his first home run yesterday for the White Sox, and he's definitely a home run or bust kind of situation right there. Looking at third base, Chaz Chisholm Jr. has been phenomenal this season, especially hitting for power, and he's started his Yankees career with 2 back-to-back 2 home run games. Now, he hadn't gotten but 2 hits in the next 3 games. However, the matchup here is just very juicy for him. For home runs, the metric is off the chart. He's the second or third best home run hitter on this particular slate. So when it comes to that metric, so I think he's a fantastic play at this position. And there's so much you could put him in the outfield. I don't usually like using $5,000 price players for core plays, but he just looks too good today. So I think he's in a good spot. And this position's not cheap either. So Rafael Devers looks decent today, has some run potential as well, but not either close to Jazz's potential. And he's, quite a bit more expensive. Same goes for Royce Lewis and Alex Bregman. Now, Alex Bregman's price has come up, which I'm not appreciative of because I was liking him when he was around 44,000 to 4,200. And he really hadn't done much since his price came up either. So hopefully he can get on the board today, though, as he looks like a solid option as well. Looking at the ownership here at this position, Royce Lewis, Austin Riley, Chris Morel, and Alex Bregman, with Montantero, Jazz Chisholm Jr., and Jose Caballero being lower owned with upside. Austin Riley and Chris Morel are also kind of contrarian plays on this slate. Looking at shortstop, Bobby Witt Jr. does jump off the page as a good play today. Now, his home run metric today is not as good as it's been, but he's definitely a capable player. Corey Seager, meanwhile, quite a bit less expensive, and he does draw nice home run metrics today, and he's been hitting the ball better, though he hasn't had a ton of fantasy points in some games, so he's a little bit riskier than normal. This position does not have much value. O'Neal Cruz does look good, though, for Pittsburgh. I think he's a good one-off play for Pittsburgh, as he does have absolute massive amount of power, and he's been pretty good over the last 10 games, and he's been good against Arizona this season. And he's facing Nelson, who's kind of a Hail Mary or bust play at catcher. So he's looking really solid today. C.J. Abrams also in play for the Nationals as kind of a one-off for a team that really does struggle at times this season. But the Nationals actually look kind of decent today. If we look at the rest of the position, the ownership, Willie Castro, Orlando Arcia, and Willie Adames. So you can find value in if you just want to be safe and kind of punt the position with some cheap guys. Or you could go some low-owned upside guys with O'Neal Cruz, Anthony Volpe, Kiner Falefa, and Caballero. Now, the contrarian options here, Gunnar Henderson, Anthony Volpe, Willie Adames, and Willie Castro all have some potential on the slate. Looking at outfielders, man, this position is kind of rough today. I was a little surprised to not find a lot of value that I liked here. But we do have some good plays. So Juan Soto, Aaron Judge, and Jazz Chisholm Jr. are definitely the top 3 at the position, obviously on the Yankees. The contrarian plays that are expensive, Corbin Carroll, Jordan Alvarez, Brian Reynolds, and Marcell Ozuna. But if we look at value, Josh Lowe, he's not in the greatest of matchups, but he does project really well today, and he's been hitting the ball pretty good the last game, 3, 4 games at least, and he had a monster game with 2 home runs yesterday. He's got a favorable matchup and good metrics, so he's definitely somebody I would consider. I was very close to making him a core play as well. I just the position is so weak; it's kind of hard to trust it at all right today. Adolis Garcia, meanwhile, also looks pretty solid for Texas. He's very interesting today. He has struggled throughout the season, but his home run metric was good today. A kind of surprising guy that came up in my uh, projections is Blanco for Kansas City. He does have good hitting metrics today. Not a home run threat, but he does. If he does draw the start, then he's somebody I consider as he doesn't need a ton of fantasy points to pay off, and he can kind of punt the position a little bit. Byron Buxton uh, also looks interesting for Minnesota. He is a little pricey there than I'd like, and he has struggled this season, but he's been doing better as of late. A couple of contrarian plays at the position. Brian De La Cruz. Now he's a kind of interesting position because he does have that home run upside today. He's got a really good home run metric. He's nice and cheap too, and he does feel really good to me. So I am going to consider utilizing him in some lineups. Willier Abreu also looks really solid for Boston. He's a little pricier than I'd like him to be, but he does have that home run upside as well. And then Alex Verdugo for the Yankees also looks interesting. The Yankees, see, the Yankees look really solid in the outfield today. In fact, there's 5 guys that can play the outfield position for the Yankees today, and Verdugo is definitely one of them. He's been hitting the ball pretty well, and he's nice and cheap as well. And so that's definitely a guy you could fit in either De La Cruz or Verdugo. Helps you save some money at this position that's relatively tough. As for the ownership, Byron Buxton, Juan Soto, Alex Verdugo, Matt Wallner, Aaron Judge, and Blake Perkins, Josh Lowe, Jackson Chourio, Giancarlo Stanton, and Jorge Soler. The low-owned upside guys, Jazz Chisholm Jr., Michael Taylor, Marcelo Zuna, Brian De La Cruz, Brian Reynolds, Jordan Alvarez, Whit Merrifield, and Trevor Larnach. A couple other Hail Mary contrarians, Cameron Misner, Luis Robert Jr., Giancarlo Stanton, Dalton Varsho, Alec Thomas, and Leody Taveras. My top 5 home run guys, Rice Hoskins, Matt Olson, Gary Sanchez, Matt Wallner, and Jazz Chisholm Jr. The top overall plays, Jazz Chisholm Jr., William Contreras, Jose Altuve, Matt Olson, and Josh Lowe. So with that said, guys, thank you for